It's time for another Friday update on the Canadian housing market. I've got 4 stories for you today, and they're not entirely bad this time, but they're mostly bad. It's like a 90-10 split. Maybe 95-5. First up, Vince Gaetano posted a letter from Northbridge Insurance warning builders about an increase in suspicious fires at under-construction homes. This is a very interesting story to me because in the November 10th update, I mentioned roughly a dozen news stories about fires at home construction sites in recent months. I didn't say it outright in the video, but I had a hunch that we were seeing an increase in fires due to arson because of pre-construction buyers who were unable to sell the assignment or close on their homes and were facing big potential losses or lawsuits. Now, we're basically seeing confirmation from a multi-billion-dollar insurance company that operates nationwide. They said they're seeing a quick and noticeable increase in suspicious fires at under-construction homes. On top of that, the very first recommendations they have to protect against these fires are checking if the appraised value of the home has fallen below the purchase price and to engage with buyers to see if they're having difficulty obtaining financing to close on the unit. After that, they get into more general tips on securing sites against arson. Now, while it may be satisfying to see speculators and flippers who are distorting the market finally facing some consequences for their actions, this is still bad news. It means that we're seeing homes that could have been added to the housing stock being burned down for purely financial reasons because people bet too much on housing in the first place. Personally, I would much rather see these homes get finished so people can actually live in them. Also, while I'm on the subject, I want to talk a bit about the difference between having a hunch based on anecdotes versus drawing a conclusion based on data. When I first talked about this, I really only had a hunch about what was going on. I'd seen a lot of news stories about fires at homes under construction, and some clearly involved arson, but that wasn't enough to draw a real conclusion. In fact, despite the large number of stories, I wasn't even confident in concluding that we were seeing more fires than usual, because that type of data isn't published anywhere that it's easy to find. There's always going to be a baseline rate of fires, particularly at under construction homes, because they won't have all the insulation, sheathing, and fireproofing that helps to contain fires in completed buildings. I was definitely seeing more stories about it than I'd seen in the past, but that's not enough for a conclusion for a couple of reasons. 1, I was looking for these kinds of stories, which is a bias coming directly from my own research. And 2, I was looking at these kinds of stories on social media and news sites, which means those sources are going to be feeding me more stories about it than they would have before, so there was a bias in the information flowing towards me as well. That's why it was just a hunch. On the other hand, actuaries at insurance companies have much more detailed information on the number of incidents, when they happened, and their details, so to have a major insurer come out and say that there's a significant increase in suspicious fires and tie it directly to financing issues, that makes me a lot more confident in concluding that my hunch was actually correct. So when you're looking at stuff like this, just keep in mind that it's important to consider the biases that may be involved and think about ways that your hunch might be wrong, rather than just trying to find more stories that suggest that you're right. Next, in a move that surprised absolutely no one, the Bank of Canada held rates steady again on Wednesday. While some of their comments indicated that rate hikes are still a possibility if needed to fight inflation, most analysts are more or less in agreement that rate hikes are probably done and we should start to see some rate cuts next year. We're also seeing the BAX market anticipating a drop of something like 150 basis points over the next year, along with a significant drop in the 5-year Canada bond yield. This is good news for variable rate mortgage holders and fixed rates that are coming up for renewal. RBC is still projecting that 75% of its mortgage portfolio will be renewing at higher rates by 2026, but this should provide a little relief for those people in the near term. However, the problem with this news is that rate cut predictions are largely based on a prediction that the economy is going to be weakening, so we'll be seeing less consumer spending, lower business profits, higher unemployment, etc. So while rate hikes might be good news for mortgage holders, it's also kind of bad news for everyone. In fact, speaking of bond yields, we're currently in what economists call an inverted yield curve, where short-term bonds are paying higher rates than long-term bonds. Normally, long-term bonds pay higher rates because people are more confident in economic growth in the long term, but now we're in the opposite situation. Long-term bonds are paying less because the market believes we're still heading into a recession. Interestingly, even 30-year bonds are paying less than 10-year bonds, which isn't a great sign, but that could also just be because there's not that much demand for 30-year bonds issued in Canadian dollars, because people looking for fixed income products on that timescale tend to go to the US instead. Now, I know this kind of news tends to worry people a lot, but there's no point panicking because that doesn't really help anything. However, it might be a good time to start preparing for the possibility of tough times ahead. So review your budget, or make a budget if you don't have one yet. No judgment, lots of people don't. See if there's any places you think you can save a bit of money here and there. Having a little bit of cash cushion for emergencies is always helpful. Next, with the cost of living rising rapidly, food banks are seeing a massive increase in demand across Canada. A report published by Food Banks Canada showed almost 2 million visits to food banks by Canadians in March of this year alone, which is a 32% increase since last year and a 78.5% increase since 2019. The situation in Toronto is particularly dire, with a paper by the Daily Bread Food Bank reporting more than 2.5 million visits to Toronto food banks in the past year, a 51% increase from a year earlier. In fact, just 3 years ago, the number was less than 1 million. In an interview with CP24, the CEO of Daily Bread, Neil Hetherington, said that this was the worst report that the food banks had ever issued, with an astonishing 1 in 10 Torontonians now relying on a food bank for at least some of their food. As a quick note, if you're looking to support your local food bank, I would recommend donating cash directly rather than giving things like canned food to a food drive. Food banks are much better than we are at exchanging money for food. They've got better access to supply chains and can also use the money to divert food that might have otherwise been wasted for pennies on the dollar. $10 in a cash donation will end up feeding a lot more people than $10 worth of canned food that you bought from the store. Finally, Romy Bowers, the CEO of the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, was a witness at the Senate Committee meeting on National Finance on Tuesday. You might have seen some recent news stories about how she'll be stepping down from her role at the CMHC this month in order to take a new role in risk management with the IMF. Rather than explain the story myself, I'll just play the clip of Bowers answering a question about how the government plans to address what the CMHC has identified as a 3.5 million unit shortfall in housing in the coming years. Just to be clear, the senator mentions a $3.5 million deficit in housing, but is actually referring to a shortfall of 3.5 million housing units.
So is there any kind of plan, overall plan, which would indicate how the government is hoping to get to the 3.5 million deficit in homes, or it seems like it's being done on a piecemeal basis right now?
What I would like to highlight is that when you're thinking about housing in Canada, it is mostly created by the private sector. So the government creates, conditions, makes changes to create housing, but it's actually private sector actors that create the housing. Yeah.
But is there an overall plan? I mean, we know there's a $3.5 million deficit at the end of 6 or 7 years. So it just seems like there's things being done on a piecemeal basis. But is there an overall strategy?
No, there is not a plan, but my understanding is that it's in development.
Okay, thank you.
No plan! Hell yeah, dude! Also, I think it's worth noting that while we do rely on the private sector to actually create housing, that wasn't always the case. There used to be specific government programs to create affordable housing, but then in the mid-90s we just sort of stopped. It's picked back up again recently, but not nearly at the same pace we had before. On a different note, people have been messaging me every time Pier Paul or the Conservatives reference my House versus Castle videos, which has been maybe a dozen times now. I don't really like any federal politicians, but in general, I didn't mind that much because I do think the government deserves criticism and a call to action on this issue, and frankly a bunch of other stuff too. However, they recently referenced the comparison I made in Castles Part 5 in this 15-minute video on the housing crisis, in which they basically use a bunch of out-of-context or incomplete data to absolve themselves of any responsibility whatsoever for the current situation, and try to blame it completely on the current government. I don't really appreciate my work being referenced in that context, because if they can't admit to any contribution or responsibility for this crisis during the decade that they were in power, I don't see how they're going to create any kind of real solution. Now, I obviously can't stop them from talking about my castle videos, but I can respond to some of the things that they said in that video. And some other claims that are being made on Poilievre's social media accounts, so look forward to that. That's all for this week, so thanks for watching and enjoy the weekend, I guess.